Today's guest is Bekah Karelis. Bekah has a master's in public history from WVU, where she has served as an adjunct professor. She is the historian for Wheeling Heritage, the editor of the Upper Ohio Valley Historical Review, and serves on the West Virginia Humanities Council Program Committee and the West Virginia Association of Museums Board of Directors. She co-founded the Wheeling Young Preservationist organization and has spearheaded the preservation efforts at Mountwood Cemetery. Please welcome Rebekah Karelis.
Thank you, everyone, for being here today. I'm going to try to situate myself. I have some notes. I probably should have done this before. Can you all hear me okay? All right. I have a tendency to wander away from the microphone, so just let me know if you can't hear me for any reason. Oh, that would be good. All right. And I'm glad I had a point or two. I brought my cat's toy. I was prepared to start with a point. But it's great that we have our own. About talking about Wheeling Cemeteries, because as many of you know who know me, I am a cemetery lover. I particularly like Wheeling Cemeteries. And I can tell you from my interest in them and having worked in Wheeling for over 10 years, the information is not easy to find. There's not a lot of photographs that we know of. It's just not on the surface that you can just pluck easily out of thin air. You kind of have to dig for it. And so this presentation is kind of a product of those 10 years. It's things that I have come across and pulled together. I just finished it this morning. So I'm going to be able to share what we know about some of Wheeling cemeteries. So how many people consider themselves cemetery tourists or cemetery enthusiasts? When you go to a town, do you go visit cemeteries? Well, do you know there's a name for you? You're called taphophiles. So, yeah, taphophiles. So that is a cemetery enthusiast. So you actually have a title. You can put that on your business card. This is a particularly favorite phrase. Was Nathaniel Hawthorne. Caskets, a vile modern phrase which compels a person to shrink from the idea of being buried at all, which is very appropriate. Nobody wants to die and be buried. We want to live forever. So, the earliest that we have in terms of maps dates to 1853. And on that 1853 map, which is the next slide, I will go ahead and advance to that and we'll come back. You have 5 active cemeteries. This is Mountwood here, and this is Peninsula Cemetery, which actually is probably in 1853 just in the process of being developed, just being laid out as a city cemetery. This is the East Wheeling Cemetery, and this is the Hempfield Cemetery here, and this is the Chaplain Oak Family Cemetery, and I'll go more in depth into those. There's also a cemetery at Boggs Run. It's up on the hill. I've never been to this one. I think the last time that there was any sort of article written about Boggs Run, when it was mentioned, was about 1890s. So it was a very early cemetery and supposedly where many of our settlers, first settlers of the area, were buried. But I've never gone looking for it. And it's right up off the hill above Boggs Run, supposedly. And then, of course, Stone Church Cemetery, which isn't really our focus. I do talk about that, but it's outside of Wheeling. It was located at Elm Grove. It is still there. It's a city-owned cemetery, but it dates back to the Shepherds and the Stone Church that was there, which was a very early church, and there were several very early burials there. Also in 1853, the Hempfield Cemetery, which once again is this, which is about right where we're standing right now. Yes, a little bit above us. This land was actually much taller whenever it was a cemetery, whenever they graded it, whenever the Hempfield yard was put in. So in 1853, that would have been removed. There is one early cemetery that does not have any sort of notation on any map, and that was the cemetery in North Wheeling. And it was on the west side of Main Street, and it was upon the sites of residence of George K. Week, Jacob Snyder, and the late William Shriver. And so that is about where the Snake Club is today, about in that area generally. And the last time that a Wheeling person remembered it was in about 1818, 1820. Some of the early people made mention of the North Wheeling Cemetery. That land was coveted, and so they ended up removing most of the bodies, but as you will learn, not all the bodies are always removed in the end. So those were the early cemeteries. So I'll start off with the East Wheeling Cemetery. Do you all recognize this location?
Yeah.
It's the new playing field there on the left, and the former Elks playground on the right. Here is a close-up of the map. So right there it is. So it would have followed along the section of 15th, it's actually McCulloch Street, would have followed along that way. It was deeded to Henry Moore in 1829 to be laid off and occupied as a private cemetery. But the plat was not actually recorded in the deed books until 1853, and that's what you see up on the screen right now. So it's really unknown what the cemetery looked like prior to 1853. We do have the listings of people that were buried there, but as you can see, this is even a good copy of what you get out of the deed book. It's very hard to read. Some of the local notable families that were buried there were Robert Ray, John Gilchrist, Dr. J. Morton, Edward Booth, Fielder Berry, remember that name, William McKay, S.D. Harper, Dana Hubbard, and B.W. Peterson. So even as early as 1880, there were newspaper articles where the cemetery was noted as being dilapidated and uncared for. This is the only photograph that survives of that cemetery, and this is the Paul Vault, the Thomas Paul Vault. And as you can see, it's in pretty bad shape. This is actually one of the Brown photos, so they were taken, I think, roughly in between 1880 and around 1900. Over a 10-year period, between 1890 and 1900, 300 to 400 bodies were removed from this cemetery. They wanted to turn it into a park. And I can read a little article saying, September 26, 1889, bodies are being removed from the old East Wheeling Cemetery at the corner of 16th and McCulloch Streets to other cemeteries at the rate of 10 to 20 a week. This has been going on for the past 4 or 5 weeks. There were originally about 500 internments in that cemetery. Nearly all the bodies taken up are in a dry, mummified condition. By 1910, all visible vestiges of the former cemetery were gone, and in 1920, it became the Elks Playground, because it was the Elks that donated the equipment and improved the site. And today, it still functions as a playground. But it must be noted that over the years, between a bank slippage along McCulloch Street, between the construction for the new playing field and the new playground just a few years ago, they keep finding remains. So they missed a couple. And I mentioned Fielder Berry having been buried there. It was whenever Friends of Wheeling received a phone call whenever they were putting in the new playing field that one of the construction workers had uncovered a tall, white obelisk. And he thought it was a National Road mile marker. Well, he took it home and he cleaned it up, got all the mud off, and realized that it was Fielder Berry's marble obelisk gravestone. So he called Friends of Wheeling and was like, I think I need to give this back to somebody. So, it was actually moved to Mountwood Cemetery, and we're looking for an empty plot to put the Fielder Berry marker on, because it's been in the ground since 1890, 1900, and it's in really good condition. So we just want to remember Fielder Berry because we know that we don't know where his remains are, we'll just say that. They did find, I think it was either 1.5 or 2.5 bodies when they found the Fielder Berry marker as well. And when that happens, they just, respectfully gather them up, and I think they usually rebury them in Peninsula Cemetery. So, this is an article. As you can see, I'm talking about the discoveries that they've made on that location through the years. I think this dated from the 1970s, and this is where they uncovered an unexplained arch in that area. And this is even in the 70s. No one really remembered that it was a cemetery because 60 years had lapsed, several generations had gone by. But they were rediscovering that information. But just as an aside, I wanted to talk about the vaults that were found under Main Street. And I always just like to remind people that, there's such a strong preservation and history community here in Wheeling. And we know a lot. We know a lot about our history, but we're uncovering things every day. And the fact, just like they uncovered that tunnel or vault under the East Wheeling Cemetery under the playground, we also uncovered these vaults under Main and Market Street. And there were several people that did know about their existence, but it really wasn't general knowledge. These were the ones that were just dismantled about where the health plant is today. And it was part of the Welty building. You can see here on this illustration, this lower level, it's an arch. So this was the vault down here where they stored all the wine. And so even though those were dismantled on Main and Market Street, this one still exists on the island. And it's actually under the, what do they call it, the wine cellar apartments, which is right across the street from Golden Chopsticks. And they built the foundation, that's actually part of the foundation of the house. They built it directly over it. So it's neat to know that one still exists and it's the same exact design. But we're not really sure if the East Wheeling one was one of those or if it might have just been a vault, a burial vault of some kind. Here is a map from 1901 showing the cemetery is now known as East End Park. So it's completely gone. The next cemetery I wanted to mention is Chaplain Oak Cemetery, and this was one of the early ones. This was where the Chaplain and Oak family was buried. But I think they thought there were about 200 bodies there total. It was located at the head of 23rd Street. So it's this area right here. And in it were buried the chaplains and oaths and other early settlers. The construction of Route 250 went through a large part of where the cemetery was located, but there are still sections in existence. I also haven't found this one yet, but there are still gravestones, legible gravestones, kind of pushed around. No one's really sure if it's the exact site of where the cemetery was. But also you can find articles in the newspaper, like this one in 1892. Workmen excavating for a street in the Old City Cemetery. The old graveyard was the principal burying ground of the city in its day. The last burial took place about 16 or 18 years ago, so that would have been about the 1870s or late 60s. And at that time, the cemetery was in good condition. It was neatly fenced in, the graves were well kept, with an abundance of shade, flowers, and shrubbery. When the authorities ceased to pay attention to it, it rapidly went to destruction. The fence decayed and was destroyed by boys. Cows and other domestic animals were permitted to roam about among the graves without being disturbed. The boys amused themselves by starting stones on the hillside, which crashed against the tombstones and destroyed them. The trees died and the heavy rains washed deep ruts. Deep ruts in the graveyard. Heavy rains washed fragments of human bones and skulls, and while all this was going on, no steps were taken to preserve the cemetery. Persons living in that section of the city who needed stones for building or other purposes secured them from the cemetery. The tombstones were broken and their inscriptions almost effaced. Many relatives of persons who were buried in the cemetery had the bodies removed, but hundreds were allowed to remain. and the chaplain and oath heirs, they removed their family's remains, and then they marked a majority of the cemetery off into lots and started to sell them. So that's what happened to the Chaplain and Oak Cemetery. And that leads us on to the Hempfield Cemetery, which is the one that's about where we are now. This cemetery was deeded by Noah Zane and his wife Mary in 1816, and it was deeded to the city. William Irwin was mayor, specifying that the land was for the use, purpose, and advantage of a burying ground. And we don't have any pictures of this cemetery. The bodies from the North Wheeling burial ground were immediately moved to Hempfield. The grounds were bounded by Chaplain on the west, 17th on the south, Oath on the east, and the northern boundary was in front of the Capitol, or the city-county building now. The cemetery was actually on the outskirts of town at that time, so it wasn't a very urban area. But Wheeling grew so quickly during the 1800s that suddenly everyone was surrounding this property. There were houses and there were buildings and industry popped up and surrounding it. And it was a large tract of land. I don't have a map for that one. So the interments did continue until 1850s, when the Hempfield Railroad, which was part of the B&O Railroad, began looking around for a terminal point upon which to erect a depot, and the old cemetery was selected as a site. It is said that Ebenezer Zane and his wife Elizabeth and their son John and Jonathan Zane were all buried in the Hempfield Cemetery, and it was finally abandoned in 1852 to make room for the B&O Railroad, aka the Hempfield Yards, and that's why it's known as the Hempfield Graveyard. But it was actually a city-owned and city-maintained cemetery. It's important to note the grade of this cemetery was actually much, much higher than what we know it today. It vastly changed when it went from the cemetery to rail yard, and it was estimated that almost 5,000 people were buried in the Hempfield Cemetery. Most of the bodies were removed to Mountwood and Peninsula Cemetery. So I just wanted to mention here the shift of the cemetery going from a churchyard cemetery into an actual rural type cemetery is a whole movement during the 1800s, and it was really a movement that depended on a couple of different factors. In Wheeling especially, you understand that the Hempfield Cemetery and also the East Wheeling Cemetery, it was a matter of space. People wanted that space. When you're dead and buried, you're considered an object, not necessarily a person anymore. And after people forget you, and your family might not be around to care about what happens to the gravestones, people just decide that they can dig them up and move them somewhere else. Another factor was the dead are deadly. And this is during a time in the 1800s when corpses were considered injurious and destructive agencies of putrefying animal substances. So basically, and this was before germ theory developed in the late 1800s, so everyone thought that dead people were dangerous, that they carried disease, they caused you to get sick. People didn't understand why they were getting sick, but they thought, when you smell something bad, you want to get away from it. And corpses, once they're putrefying, they do smell pretty bad. So even in the ground, there are still some things that happen. And if you live right next to a cemetery in the 1800s, you would have probably smelled things. So that was another factor. Cities pressed the living and the dead closer together. It's also another one of those things where the living did not want to necessarily live right next to a cemetery or a graveyard. In the early 1800s, the age of the olfactory vigilance, all smell is disease. And that was a real, vein of thought during the 1800s, is that smelling it would cause disease. And this is a time whenever people started to become aware of unwashed bodies and that sort of thing. So they started to be more aware of smells, and so putrefying corpses was another smell that they needed to avoid. So just as you see the cemeteries that I talk about next, you start to see we're not in downtown Wheeling anymore, we're going outside of town. So Mountwood Cemetery, this is the one near and dear to my heart, which got me in all this mess to begin with. There's very few photographs, historic photographs of the cemetery, and the library has 3 of them. 3 of them, and then they have 3 scans from a book as well. This is a picture of the very first gate, which is not where the gate is today. Here's another photograph. This is the Dauber family, and this is actually kind of down over the hill. Here are a few other historic photographs. The Henry K. List vault. The one on the left is actually, the lists were removed from both of those mausoleums you see in that photograph, and they were moved to Greenwood Cemetery, which was a very common thing once cemeteries were considered unpopular, dilapidated. The descendants didn't feel like they were getting proper care, and there were always better options, aka Greenwood and Mount Calvary Cemetery. So a lot of bodies were moved several times over their existence in the ground. It's interesting to see, but the List family, they both got moved to Greenwood. This is the Wilson Monument. And as you can see, this would have looked very different from any of the cemeteries that you would have found downtown. The downtown cemeteries would have been more of your churchyard type cemeteries, where everything is close together, not necessarily bushes or trees or flowers. In this, you see how beautiful it looks. Our cemeteries in this country were our first parks, for the most part. This is where everyone would go on the weekends to visit with their deceased loved ones. They'd picnic and they'd frolic among the gravestones and take care of the gardens. It's a much different ideology than we have today about our cemeteries. And here's the last picture that we have. You can see here, this is from the river, and this is the Wheeling Hospital here complex. So you see up the hill, Mountwood's up here. You can kind of make out some gravestones. That would have been about 1900. Here's another photograph. The cemetery is here. This is the Peninsula down here, and the horseshoe curve of Wheeling Creek in Wheeling Hill, Route 40. And so this would be the way up Mountwood Road up to the cemetery. These were the gates that were installed by Louis Birchie in the 1920s. And this is what it looks like today. You can see if I flip back and forth, they just removed this middle column here and all the fence as well, probably to make it more of a vehicle access point. Here is the early picture, and this is from the 1853 map. Mountwood Cemetery was established in 1848, and it was a privately owned cemetery. There was a cemetery association of, I think there were about 10 different men. And here's the original layout. Total, there were over 1,000 plots, and the magic number is usually 16 by 16 feet each plot. And you can fit a lot of corpses in one of those plots. The men who established the cemetery were buried in Section A, which is right there, and this is a picture of it. That's kind of the penthouse kind of area of the cemetery. It's the only flat place in the cemetery, but so it's no wonder that they were buried there. And I always tell people they were the who's who of Wheeling in the 1830s and 1840s. We don't know who they are, but at one point they were really they were the movers and shakers of the town. So at some point, and I've never been able to nail down a date, the cemetery was enlarged. They added all of these sections here, and probably right before the turn of the century. They said that by 1879, so within 30 years, those 1,000 plots of the original layout were almost filled. Interestingly, once they added another 1,000 plots, they filled barely any. I don't think they sold, but maybe 300 or 400. We have very few people buried, and they're all buried along this line. And this is all just basically urban wasteland. It's all trees and it's the whole hillside. This is Market Street here, Main Street, Market Street. And I think there were eventually houses built on the lower part, but this is just all wooded and just a big mess of jungles and briars and everything. So this cemetery was laid out in what's called the Rural Romantic Movement. And it was the movement, it was about the 1850s, and it was that whole concept of moving cemeteries out of towns and out of crowded conditions and making them beautiful places. The whole idea is that, if you're a dead person and you're waiting for, the day whenever God comes back, you want to be doing it in a peaceful place, beautiful place. So that's kind of the concept behind the whole thing. Mountwood also does have a Jewish section, and it was the first Jewish burial ground in Wheeling, and it was established shortly after the Mountwood Cemetery Association established a larger cemetery. As the story goes, there was a sizable Jewish population here in Wheeling, and there was an itinerant rabbi that would come in and offer services. And he rode into town one day and immediately dropped dead. So in the Jewish tradition, you have to bury him within 24 hours. So they approached the Mountwood Cemetery Association and purchased a part of it. And it is very well maintained. Temple Shalom still maintains it. And it's the lower section of the cemetery. They do a really good job, especially because it's the steepest part of the cemetery. I always loved this. This was a little discovery that we made when we were looking into the history of the Mountwood Overlook. And it's kind of hard to see, but this is, let me orient myself. This is Mountwood Cemetery here. This is Mountwood Road. Here's National Road down here. Here's Mountwood Road. So you're coming up to the hill of the cemetery. This is the Jewish cemetery, and this is the cemetery as a whole. But then you have the Mountwood Overlook. Everybody familiar with the Overlook? The castle, yes. It was found here in this section of property. And you can barely make out here, it says Soldiers Cemetery. And sorry, this is a picture with a lot of glare because this map is the best map, 1871 map. It's hanging in Wheeling Coffee and Spice. The city doesn't have a copy of this. But you can see here's the cemetery, here's the Jewish cemetery. This is Mountwood Road down to National Road. And here is where the overlook is, the castle, and it says Soldiers Monument. And so we were confused because there's no cemetery there and there's no monument there. Well, it turns out that in 1865, there was actually an event, and there was a procession. Processions were very popular then. It was a procession up to the area that would be the Soldier Cemetery for the laying of the cornerstone of the monument in the Soldier Cemetery. The procession formed at 7 a.m. on July 4th, 1865. The military met on 4th Street. Schools were involved. The governor was there. He made the dedication for the cornerstone of the monument. State officers, mayor, council, city officers, orator, chaplains, the Masonic fraternity, the Independent Order of Odd Fellows, the Order of Redmond, and it was just a whole list of people. And of course, you need horsemen in a parade. But that happened. They laid a cornerstone, and they were determined to make that into the Soldier Cemetery. This was right after the Civil War. A lot of Wheeling young men and old men, they perished in the war, and they wanted to have a cemetery that would be part of Mountwood Cemetery, where they would be buried. And that was actually the first location for the Soldiers and Sailors Monument that was never built. The Soldiers and Sailors Monument wouldn't be built until 1880, but they had originally intended to build the Soldiers and Sailors Monument up in the Soldier Cemetery that was a part of Mountwood Cemetery. And Mountwood, the Cemetery Association, acquired the land that they were going to do that on. But 2 years later, you find a letter to the editor in the newspaper in 1867. It says, "We are sorry to learn column, a considerable interest in our local affairs manifested by you of late, all of which I heartily endorse. Such being the fact, can't you give us some light as to the disposition made of the $14,000 appropriated by the Sanitary Fair Association of our city, county, and state to the Soldiers' Aid Society? I know of $22,000 or $23,000 net having been made out of the Sanitary Fair, $14,000 of which were appropriated to the Soldiers' Aid Society. And I have never, up to present time, heard a word of how it was expended. I did hear of a 4th of July march and procession and all that kind of thing to inaugurate, so said, a soldiers' cemetery on the top of a hill in close proximity to the city. What has been done since that great display of earnestness and on the soldiers' behalf? I have not heard nor of the financial doings of the Soldiers' Aid Society of Wheeling, West Virginia. Can't you give us some light? Yours, Sanitary Fair. So it never came to fruition, and really that letter to the editor is the only thing I've ever been able to uncover as to why it ever came to fruition. But the area that was the Soldiers' Cemetery, which would later become the Mountwood Castle and Mountwood Overlook, it was laid out in plots and plats for people to purchase, and there were structures by the turn of the century. So I'm not really sure whatever happened, but it's interesting to note that it never did happen. And here's just some pictures. These are some older pictures of the castle. This is actually kind of looking down from National Road at the corner of Mountwood and National Road. Here's a further away scene. And these are both, this one's turn of the century. This one's about 1930s, I think, 1920s. And you can see the castle up there, and you can see it up there. So, it's interesting. This is my favorite monument at Mountwood. It was built by a stonemason. We had a lot of quarries in Wheeling, and a lot of our sandstone actually came from along Wheeling Creek around the Peninsula area. And this was built by a stonemason in the memory of his wife. And you can see it's very unique. This is a story I love to share about something that happened in Mountwood. A cat burglar, Mr. Bruce Van Leer, you see there on the right, he kidnapped and held hostage a young Warwood couple in 1961. Bruce Van Leer, a young convict, approached the couple while parking on Mountwood Road. I guess it was popular even back in the 60s to park on Mountwood Road. He then held the couple captive, tied them up, and left them in one of the mausoleums overnight. They were able to escape the next day. Van Leer had also been convicted of other charges. He robbed Kennedy Hardware, and he was caught several times window peeping in North Wheeling. He earned the cat burglar name by climbing on roofs to break into homes in East and North Wheeling. So in the 1970s, that is whenever the official turnover of Mountwood Cemetery from the Private Cemetery Association to the city of Wheeling happened. And it happened mainly because a bad round of vandalism went through the cemetery in about 1977. The mausoleums had been continuously broken into, remains scattered, they were robbed. So at the time, all the Private Cemetery Association members were elderly, and they ended up taking over, the city took over their accounts and also taking care of the cemetery. So that happened in 1977. My next is the Catholic Cemetery. This cemetery was established in 1861 when the diocese acquired 1.3 acres of land at the town of Manchester. Does everyone know where that is or was? Do you know where Rock Point Road is? Manchester Bridge, where it was? Yeah, that where the old brewery was along the hillside. Once you crossed over the Manchester Bridge, that was the Manchester area up to the top of the hill. So it was actually, if you were going up that road, the Catholic Cemetery would have been on the right. You can see it here. This would have been the Manchester Bridge in Wetzel Street. That would have gone up. There are a couple neat photographs of this place. Prior to 1850, the Roman Catholics were largely buried in the Hempfield Cemetery and the East Wheeling Cemetery. And at that time, when in 1872 Mount Calvary was established, they moved all bodies out of the Catholic cemetery in Manchester. Here's a great round photo as well.
Wow.
The emptied old, and these are iron sarcophagus, basically. And I'm not really sure why they would have been left behind, because there would have been remains in there. And the whole of the face, that would have been glass, so that you could have looked inside and see the person buried inside. And here you got some guys playing around with them, just hanging out. After they moved all the bodies, the remains to Mount Calvary, the diocese had trouble getting rid of the property because it had been deeded to be used only for the purpose of a Catholic burial ground. But it was eventually sold to private owners sometimes in the 1970s. And it was said to only have been used for about 10 years before Mount Calvary was established in 1872. So it didn't last very long. So the next is Peninsula Cemetery. This would have become the city cemetery after Hempfield would have been sold to the B&O. So the city purchased 21 acres on the peninsula, which interesting to note that it was originally named the Peninsular Cemetery, not Peninsula as we know it today. Because of the Hempfield cemetery conditions, it became necessary for the city to look for new burial grounds. A committee was appointed to purchase a new site and to remove the old one. And they actually first looked in Leatherwood to put a new cemetery, but I guess the folks there who lived there, it was a small community, a small grouping of houses, but they really fought it and they ended up taking it to court to not let them put the cemetery there. But whenever they moved the, whenever they laid out the original cemetery, the entrance today is down here. You can see it was a very large cemetery, very large. And this is actually Rock Point Road right now. And then this is in the peninsula, this is Fulton. Fulton's over here. This is the road that you follow around it, and this is the entrance. They actually added this later to the bottom, this area over here, they added this, and this is the entrance that we know today to get into the Peninsula Cemetery. But, and I'll show you a map here in a minute, this is where Interstate 70 went through. When they put the tunnels in, it cut through the cemetery. All this area here was taken out for Interstate 70. Here's another map, just a little bit more. It's a strange shape, but it follows the ridge line. When the Interstate 70 went through, of course, it was a government-funded project, so they had to systematically remove thousands of bodies. A contract was made with a company out of Aiken, South Carolina, to do the removal, and they graded down about 8 feet in the cemetery to be sure that they removed. They actually went through and basically prodded for bodies, and these were professionals, I guess. So they would go through and they'd flag where all the bodies were, just using, prodding, and then they would come back and remove those. The gravestones were supposedly all removed and placed elsewhere. Greenwood received a lot of them, as well as Mountwood, but the Greenwood area, I've heard, was more of a mass grave. Instead of moving all the stones, they only moved parts of them. And this is an early photograph of one of the stones. You can see how beautiful it is. It's a sandstone. Like I said, there were quarries locally, and there were a lot of carvers locally who would have made the gravestones that are found in a lot of our cemeteries. The marble and a lot of the granite would have come from outside. Marble was very, very popular in the 1800s as gravestones. Unfortunately, it doesn't weather very well. So by 1900, they realized that, and granite became very popular. Here's a picture of the Peninsula Cemetery graves registration. So this is the part that the Interstate went through. And so, because that happened, going back to that original long map, and I showed you where Rock Point Road was, it created what's known today as Manchester Cemetery, because it is in Manchester, but it was actually part of the Peninsula Cemetery before the Interstate went through. And this is what it looks like today. And these are very early gravestones. These wouldn't have dated, because you see the one there, that's the year of 1821. So that would have been one of the gravestones that would have been moved there from either Hempfield or East Wheeling Cemetery, or who knows, maybe the North Wheeling Cemetery. This is one of the old roads. Now, unfortunately, if you walk in this area, you can find little patches where they just piled up gravestones. So you don't know, I couldn't even tell you, if they ever moved the bodies or what exactly happened, but not all the gravestones were moved with the bodies, unfortunately. And the original entrance to that cemetery would have been where Manchester Cemetery is today. There was actually like a fancy little drive and a little circle area, and it would have been a very steep hill to climb from Manchester to get there. The job took 60 days to relocate the bodies in 1963, and it was nearly 2,100 graves to be moved. And it was a team of 14 experts, and it was a very long and tedious process because they had to do so much research to find out who the families were, and all attempts must have been made to contact the relatives. They dig deep enough to uncover the casket and remains, and a licensed funeral director was on site to check the remains, and that's a state law. After it had been inspected, each casket was tagged, and then if they had located the family member, they were able to tell them where they wanted the remains moved. Otherwise, the officials would have determined where the move would have been made to. All right, Mount Zion Cemetery. This was known as the German Cemetery. It was located about 1 mile up Caldwell's Run, and it's the property of the Zion Lutheran congregation, which is the church where Towngate Theater is today. It began in 1863 as a 6-acre purchase from Mr. Caldwell, and the first burial there was Anna Hoffmeister. She was a child buried on November 22nd of 1863. In the beginning, there were 16 square feet and 445 plots. And by 1880, all of them had been sold. So they were starting to plan to enlarge the cemetery, which they did. This is the only known picture I know of Mount Zion Cemetery, and this would have been about, I think it was Decoration Day, which would become Memorial Day. Unfortunately, Mount Zion is a sad story because, much like Mountwood, it was owned by a church, and then it had been a private cemetery association, and they just ran out of money and ran out of people, and they turned it over to the county. The county didn't officially take ownership of it, but they said that they'd take care of it as long as the money held out, and so they kept their promise, and they took care of it for many years until they ran out of money, and it's very expensive to take care of that cemetery. The ironic thing is Miss Irene Meagle, a lady down in South Wheeling, left many millions to the cemetery. Unfortunately, it can't be used for maintenance, so they can't use it to mow the grass. And I'm sure you guys have seen newspaper articles. There's a lot of there needs to be more of an effort. Unfortunately, it's such a difficult thing to try to save our cemeteries. It's definitely a challenge. Of course, Greenwood Cemetery, I have to admit, I'm not partial to Greenwood or Mount Calvary because they have endowments and lots of money, and people take care of them. So I don't actually know as much about Greenwood, but it was established in the 1860s, and it was a group of men who did that, of course, in 1866. And by 1880, over 1,000 bodies were interred within that 20 years. It is the largest cemetery in Ohio County, and it's also the most photographed and the most postcards. So, One of the founders was actually a Mendel, George Mendel, who was a very well-known furniture maker here in the 1800s. And he made a lot of furniture for steamboats, but he was actually one of the first undertakers, because cabinet makers and furniture makers just went into the coffin business because it made sense. They knew how to do that stuff. And the Mendels would actually go on to partner with a Kepner in the late 1800s, and that would become Kepner Funeral Homes. So they had something to do with that, the Kepners. Mount Calvary Cemetery. There was a movement in 1867 and 1868 to establish a cemetery for Catholics also in Leatherwood. But a beautiful place was chosen by the committee, but Bishop Wheeling kind of exercised his seniority and chose the site that would become Mount Calvary. He purchased 32 acres from Edward Larkin in 1872, and the first interment was made later that year. There's also many pictures of Mount Calvary. It's a beautiful cemetery. That is the sexton's house, the caretakers along National Road. I'm sure you've seen that right outside. And then, of course, it is also the location where the men that were killed in the Benwood mine disaster are buried. There's some great photographs of them burying those poor men. Stone Church Cemetery, which is located just beyond Elm Grove. It was named after the stone church that was located in the middle of the cemetery, and it's a very old cemetery. I don't think we realize how many old burials are there, because many of the early burials were just marked with field stones. And no records survive of those early burials. Stone Church, I do believe, had a fire at one point, and a lot of records were destroyed if there had been any. The cemetery was said to be older than the church because the shepherds were the one who established the cemetery before the church was even built. It was, at first, I think, a family cemetery and a cemetery that served the locals. And they say that many of the first burials there were made during the time of Fort Henry, when everyone still had rifles on their shoulder. In it lies the remains of Moses Shepherd, Louis Kruger, and Lydia Kruger. And in 1865, which is when this map dates from, it was laid out, and you can see it looks much the same, but this is the area where they just lump in, this is the old graves. So they don't really know if there's plots or who's buried where. We do have some Stone Church Cemetery papers. Thanks to Dodie over there, she has some Stone Church Cemetery. She helped us get some information from the church archives. But there are a few things that exist. This is an early picture of a Ku Klux Klan gathering. Whether it was a Ku Klux Klan funeral, this is what was taken within the cemetery. And it looks to be about 1920s maybe. It is crazy. This is another one. I just discovered this one, the elusive Redmond Cemetery. Has anyone heard of the Redmond? It is, the Order of Redmond was really a large and influential order in Wheeling, and it was tribe Logan number 21. And they purchased land, about 7 acres in 1862, so it was a fairly early cemetery. But it was a place where members of the organization could be buried with their families. We're not entirely sure how many people were buried there, but it could be up to about 800. We're not sure how many people are still there. It is on private property now. This was taken from the deed book. It's kind of hard to read, but this is the entrance road, and so this is the road going up to get to the cemetery. It's up on top of the hill. It's off of 29th Street, and it's behind Bowman's Addition. And here's one of the old roadways through it. And this is pretty much what it looks like. In 1976, an article noted that there were about 25 grave markers that were counted, and that's about how many we counted when we were there 2 years ago. So, whether there's more, it's just overgrown and it's on a hill, so it's hard to tell. These tombstones can just fall over and they just disappear after a couple years of leaves, gathering on top of them. So that's just a quick run through of some of the cemeteries, and I just wanted to throw a few things out there. I found this article in '91. I think Margaret Brennan brought it to me. It's Margaret here. That tombstones in the valley deteriorate faster than anywhere in the United States. And I'm not sure if that's necessarily true of all of our gravestones, but our marble gravestones is very true. Because marble is a porous stone that is very much affected by acid rain. So as you can see, whenever you're working in some of the older cemeteries with older markers, most of the marble stones are illegible, unfortunately. We have always dealt with vandals, a lot of vandalism in our cemeteries, and we also, because of our West Virginia nature, a lot of our cemeteries are on hills. So we have gravity, and also as part of our rural romantic movements, a lot of our cemeteries have trees. And if the proper maintenance isn't taken to prune those trees, the three things together just wreak havoc on our cemeteries. And so that's really what we've started doing at Mountwood Cemetery, which I hope by now everyone's heard of the Mountwood Cemetery Restoration Project. But we've been going strong for 4 years, and we've had over 1,000 volunteer hours, and a lot of sweat and tears gone into the place. But I encourage every one of you to drive through the cemetery. The road's a little tricky, but don't be scared, you're not going to fall off. Or roll down the hill or anything. And it's not a dangerous place. But I encourage you all to go up there because it is beautiful and it is still a park. It's still a city-owned park. And it's important that people use it still. And it's a great place if you have visitors to go show them the view of the valley. And as my last slide, I just want to put a plug in for our fundraiser book sale that will fundraise money for our Mountwood Restoration Project. It's going to be in 2 weeks from today, tomorrow, yesterday. Yeah, what is today? I forgot what today was. But it's a huge book sale. If you're a book lover, if you know any book lovers, please tell them about it. We're going to have over 10,000 books. They're very cheap, 50 cents to $2, and you'll get a couple bargains. Monday night, we're doing something a little different. November 6th is when the sale, we'll have a little pre-sale, where if you want to be the first to shop the sale, you pay $5 to get in the door from 5 to 7 on Monday. But if you just want to come to the general sale, it's 9 a.m. to 7 p.m. Tuesday through Saturday, November 7th through 11th. So come by and see us. So, thank you.
My first question has to do with the phrase you use to call people who go to cemeteries. How do you spell it?
The taphophile?
Yes.
T-A-P-H-A-P-H-I-L-E-S.
A-L.
I-L-E-S. Taphophiles, which is taphophile. Yeah.
I grew up in Center Wheeling. And between 22nd and 23rd. I grew up in Center Wheeling, and between 23rd and 24th Street, up on the hill.
Yeah.
I forget it was almost to the top, but there was a graveyard up there.
And I do believe that was the Chaplain Oak graveyard, the family graveyard. What year would that have been? Around about 1950s? So that would have been before Route 2250? Yeah. Yeah, so it might have still been there in more of an entirety than it was today.
Yeah, the stones, someone like you said.
There's a very small group of dedicated volunteers who are working in Mount Zion that has done wonders over the summer. It's beautiful.
She said that there's a small group of volunteers working at Mount Zion. So is there any way to get involved, or if people want to get involved in that?
Paula Stein.
Contact Paula Stein. She's on Facebook, isn't she?
Yes.
I remember I was telling her up there by
Oh, there you are.
4th Street.
You can talk to her back there in the corner.
Playground? Yeah.
Back up. Are they still burying people in Mountwood? And who do you see to buy a plot?
Plots are not actually for sale at Mountwood Cemetery yet. I think it would be a great idea for them to bring that back because there are lots of plots that are available. You can be buried there. The last person that was buried there was 2008. The city does not have records of who owns the plot. You have to be able to show the city that you or your family owns a plot there, and they will let you be buried there still.
Who do you contact?
Well, there is, you contact the city of Wheeling, and I'm not really sure who would be best at the city to talk to, probably Rusty Tibia. I would guess. There is a cemetery guy named Jacob Basinger, and I'm not really sure what he does exactly. Right, at the city county building. Any other questions?
Well, thank you for all your research, by the way. It's really interesting. But did you say that the $14,000 for the soldiers was in 1870?
It was 1865.
Okay, because in today's dollars, I have an app that converts to today's dollars with inflation. That was $251,970.
Does everybody hear that? That $14,000 that the sanitary fair raised in 1865 was
$251,970.77.
$251,000 change dollars.
That's a lot of money.
And so they were probably really concerned where'd all that money go. You know? But the Soldiers and Sailors Monument was eventually built, and it was put right in front of the city county building in the 1880s.
I remember that. We used to sit on that when we had the parades. We used to sit on it.
Yes. Peninsula Cemetery was the city cemetery.
Soldiers and Sailors Monument. You used to sit right on the parade.
Well, thank you all for coming. If there's no more questions.
Thank you.
Yodeling Dick here to tell you about a happening. Lunch with books. Lunch with books, that's Coxie, Coxie, Haxie, Fraxie, yells and sings. Rocks and swings with more and more. Lunch with books. Lunch with books. At the Ohio County Public Library in Wheeling, West Virginia. It'll make you feel like yodeling. Hey, yodie, 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 hey, yodie, yodie, mostly on Tuesdays at noon. Bring your lunch, we'll provide the pot. And it's all free. Lunch with books. Knowledge is served.